Welcome to Veterans in Transition. Each week we travel around the region highlighting veteran-related news, issues, and events. Clinical Professor of Psychiatry and author of War Stories from the Forgotten Soldiers, Dr. Edward W. Beal writes that sharing in the soldier's moral grief is not just a national duty, rather it's a moral obligation that we citizens owe to soldiers who fought in their place. What do the words, "a grateful nation," truly mean at a time when only 1% of the population actually serve in defense of our country? Correspondent Lisa Shenkle sat down with Dr. Beal to discuss his book, War Stories from the Forgotten Soldiers.
Welcome, Dr. Beal, and thank you for joining us today. Your book, War Stories from the Forgotten Soldiers, is a profound exploration into the divide that exists between those who have served in the military and those who have not. That divide is reflected in many ways in society, and your mission is to correct that, least one of those, and that's communication. Before we delve into the book, tell us a little bit about you and your own experience in the United States military. I believe you were in the Army, and your experience that precipitated the book.
Well, in 1967, after I just graduated from medical school, in the middle of the Vietnam War, I got a personal letter from President Lyndon Johnson that said, "You will arrive at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon wearing combat boots and khaki uniform." So I went to basic training at Fort Sam in Texas, where all the physicians went. And, you know, I was anxious about the war and where I'd be, et cetera, so I naively thought there was a front line, and I wanted to get back at a division level, so I volunteered for all sorts of different specialties. And I ended up being chosen to teach preventive medicine diseases. So my job was to teach things like diagnosis and treatment of malaria to all the military physicians going to Vietnam. So as a part of that, actually I was very concerned about going though, and I thought a lot about being a conscientious objector or a CO. And then I decided, you know, I was really just sort of opposed to this war, not all wars. So when I was on the faculty there, my wife got this letter from the commanding general, the CEO of the base, saying, "You will arrive wearing white gloves and white hat at a tea." So she went, and it had rained that day, and it was. She ended up in the cloakroom with this woman, and she said, "Hi, my name is such and such, and what does your husband do?" And the woman said, "Oh, he's the CO of the base." And my wife said, "Oh, my husband tried to be a conscientious objector too." And she came home and told me that story. I said, "You said what?" You know? But anyway, that's that. I ended up being there for 2 years, and then, like most people, I didn't pay too much attention to the military until 9/11 came.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's true for most of us, to be perfectly honest. In War Stories from the Forgotten Soldier, it's such an insightful journey into the minds of our returning veterans, and there are 31 stories in the book, but you developed those stories from 5,000 listening sessions over the course of 7 years. Tell us a little bit about what are these 5,000 listening sessions and how that came about.
Well, after 9/11, you know, people were concerned about the military, et cetera, and I heard about this job at Walter Reed where psychiatrists would be seeing soldiers, and actually we saw soldiers, Marines, Air Force people, et cetera, through telepsychiatry, and that's remote closed-circuit TV to places all over the United States. So, so I went in and I volunteered for the training, and we supplied services to Fort Bragg, Fort Hood in Texas, Fort Drum in New York, and several places around Maryland, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Fort Detrick, et cetera. And yeah, we had a remarkable number of opportunities to provide treatment to these people.
Remarkable. The mission of your book is to bring awareness to the 99%, it's a huge number, of Americans who do not serve. Through your sessions, you listen to stories. You experience them practically firsthand from listening to the mental anguish. And along with these veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, you have tried to explain to readers in very graphic detail what these soldiers go through. And can you share some of those stories with us? I mean, they're quite profound and disturbing. I can understand why you started to write these down.
Well, I can list sort of a number of them. One person came in, and after several sessions, he very embarrassingly told me that when he's out in social situations and he's with people who are slightly overweight, he begins to hallucinate the smell of rotting flesh. Another situation where a soldier came in and he thought a teenager had jumped into his vehicle, and he thought he was a terrorist, and he shot him. And he didn't do anything about it until his son became the same age as the teenager, and then he had tremendous nightmares about it. Frequently people would just come in for medications for their symptoms, but I insisted they tell me the story. And you know, one soldier told me he was driving a vehicle in his convoy. They were passing a bunch of vehicles on the side of the road. Suddenly the vehicle turned into theirs, and it was a suicide bomber and blew up his vehicle. And he was the only person capable of driving at that point, so he gets in the car to drive, and suddenly he can't see, and it's because the remains of the suicide bomber are all across the windshield.
Oh my.
Another person who was the suicide prevention officer came in because her best friend had just committed suicide and she missed the signs. She just cried continuously for an hour. So there are all these kinds of things, and I found that the families really needed to be resources for people. For example, the person who was hallucinating the smell of flesh, I mean, this is a psychotic level symptom, but the person was clearly not psychotic. And we traced that back to he'd been in Bosnia, and he, along with others, had uncovered a grave of 4,000 bodies of rotting flesh. And he was just overcome by the hatred of it and the smell of it, and he just stored it away in his brain, and then suddenly, as he was, this is 10 years later, out in public, things would remind him of it. And you know, the moral of the story is he thought he was crazy, and he needed to connect his symptoms somehow to what his experience had been. The first thing I told him was, you have to go home and tell your wife. Well, he thought this was a crazy idea, but the point is, soldiers want these experiences to be kind of normalized, to be told that they're not mentally ill, that they're not crazy. And so part of it is listening to them, and also it's getting other people to kind of absorb the pain that's really helpful to them.
Absolutely. It's interesting, too, that you had advised them to involve their family members in their stories, because, in fact, that's what you had to do after listening to these stories. And I'm curious about that, because you started journaling your experiences, which actually led to the book, War Stories from the Forgotten Soldiers. And I'd like to know a little bit about how you decided to start journaling, and I believe your wife encouraged you, or a friend?
Well, I would, for example, with a soldier who didn't know whether he'd shot a teenager or a terrorist, he was having trouble with his wife because his son was getting ready to go off to college, and he wanted him to go to a military academy. And I said, you know, you have to tell your wife about this. I mean, you can't keep this inside of it. So I found myself making these recommendations to people, and when I would go home and talk to my wife, and she'd be kind of stunned by some of these stories, she would say, well, you really need to write this down. And then a friend who ran a newsletter encouraged me to do it, and I found that if I could write down the stories and talk about the stories, then I got a certain emotional distance from it, and I would be able to be more helpful to people. And so many times when they'd come in, instead of getting overwhelmed by the story, I would say, well, now, how would this look if I told this as a story? Well, finally I was able to accumulate a lot of them, and I think it's really important that people know about these things.
You juxtapose ballpark patriotism with that of the battlefield, and both are genuine and appreciated, but I'd like you to share your thoughts on that juxtaposition and how it affects our perception as citizens.
Well, after I'd been doing this for a couple of years, it suddenly, it's obvious, but it dawns on you is that these people are there so that you don't have to go. Mm-hmm. And you know, I discovered this, really 99.5% of us don't go, and these soldiers go. So when I would go to ball games, like a football game or a baseball game, you know, and you'd see what I'd call ballpark patriotism as opposed to battlefield patriotism, you have 40,000 people in the stands cheering these 40 or so soldiers who are happy to get the acknowledgement but don't really want it to be treated as heroes. And that's it. You know, we don't have any more contact with these people. We don't go over and shake hands with them or greet them particularly. And you begin to realize that that ratio of about 40,000 people cheering for 40 people in the stand, that's about the ratio of the people going to war, about 100 to 1. And the military has to replace these people every year. I mean, some die, some retire, some go off to college. So you literally have to take 80,000 people a year from the civilian population and move them into the military. And that's not happening. People aren't doing that. And the only contact between the civilians and the military are recruiters. And the traffic is sort of stopped. There isn't any communication. So recruiters have to do this.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. You refer to recruiters as a traffic cop, and is that what you mean by that? That they are the go-between and that they are tasked with this job of replacing these 80,000?
I was initially, you know, a little ambivalent about recruiters because, you know, here they are, they're trying to get all these people to come in the military. Don't they really know what's happening? And then I discovered that recruiters have the highest suicide rate of any unit in the Army. That really got my attention. So when I would see recruiters, both for Marines, Navy, Army, I'd ask them about it. And they really have a difficult job. I mean, people don't want recruiters to come into their schools. Most of the middle class and upper middle class schools, even though by law you're supposed to allow recruiters, they manage through principals and parental pressure to keep recruiters at bay with kids. So recruiters are forced to go to lower income groups. And you know, we're a country that prides itself on diversity and different classes being represented. What's really happening is we're recruiting from lower income places where kids don't necessarily have a college education.
Which brings me really to our next point, is that you have a staggering statistic whereby the combined populations of New York, Chicago, and I believe Los Angeles do not really contribute as many into the service as the state of Alabama.
That's right. The 5 million people in Alabama contribute more people to the military than the combined 25 million population of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles.
And why do you think that is?
Well, because most of us who are middle class don't really want contact with the military. We've avoided it ever since the draft was done away with. And the reason it was done away with is, you know, it was politically unpopular. And so it's also one of the reasons we have unending war is because we don't really pay much of a price for it. I mean, when we sent all these people to war in the Middle East and in Afghanistan, you know, the gas prices didn't necessarily go up. There was no tax being paid. It's really all being paid on credit. And the credit is our children and grandchildren are really going to have to pay for all this.
And you've said 99% of Americans do not serve. We only have 1% of Americans who protect the rest of us.
That's right.
Now, the stories in your book, I believe that you feel that when people read these stories, it's going to help them create a sense of engagement with returning war veterans. I mean, how would you describe the effect you think the stories will have on readers?
Well, first of all, I think people should know about this. I mean, I think they should know the kind of horrific experiences that people go through. So I think you will then say, you know, it's not thank you for your service, it's really thank you for your sacrifice. I mean, these people lose arms, legs, they lose lifetime of experience, they lose time with their kids, with their spouse. That's the sacrifice that they're making, and we, I think, owe them something for that. In addition to the fact that I think part of the trauma that these people experience, and one of the reasons the suicide rate is so high, is that they're carrying around all the grief that's connected to war. And some of the, you know, like killing a teenager accidentally, that's not something you get over very easily with. It's something that has to be shared collectively, and I think we owe that to them at a minimum, and we need to engage them around that and listen carefully to what they have to say.
Yes. So the 99% of us who don't serve have compartmentalized the service of the 1%.
Absolutely.
And the 1% who do have compartmentalized their experiences.
And they come home and they don't want to share it because they don't want to harm you. They don't want to harm their spouses, so they keep it within them. And we know from a mental health standpoint, that's the absolute opposite of what you should be doing.
One of the stories in your book that I felt was particularly profound was that the story of the soldier who saw battle every day. He saw death every single day. It was quick, swift, permanent, and then when he came home, he participated in the hospice of his mother. And one of the things that you mention in the book is that he found that to be a comforting ritual, a ritual that frankly most Americans don't want to participate in. They find it depressing, they don't want to face it, and yet here the soldier is who comes in and finds a completely different perspective on that. Tell us a little bit about everyday life and the perceptions of veterans versus civilians.
Well, just to follow up on that experience, this was somebody who was riding in a vehicle and the people next to him were vaporized. They just disappeared. It was awful trying to talk to this guy. I mean, I just didn't know what to say for him. But it was striking that when he went home, he had all these terrible nightmares about it. And when he went home and saw what the natural dying process was connected to his mother, it was a whole different experience for him. And so that's something in civilian life, a ritual that we have that could be very helpful for soldiers. But in general, what you find, soldiers they live in a hyper-aroused environment. They're very mission-focused. They're very task-oriented. They're always on alert, and their adrenal gland is pumping adrenaline all the time, and it's almost addictive. So when they come home, and they're out in a shopping center, I mean, this just disappears. And they really lose focus, and ultimately then they kind of lose the sense of purpose, and they really become kind of addicted to battle. So, like in World War II, you had a couple weeks on a ship coming back, you could transition, they're just here. And one of the big problems with the suicides is, in addition to the mental health problems and the symptoms they have, the kind of sense of purposelessness. And we can really help them with that. I mean, our engagement within them, bringing them back into civilian life, hiring them to work with them, associating with them, we can help develop a sense of purpose for them.
Of course. Does this sense of purpose lead to the high rate of suicide? I believe we have a number of about 7,000 veterans who die by suicide every year. Does that have a lot to do with their sense of this lack of purpose?
I think if you talk to veterans, and yes, they're dying 20 a day, 600 a month, 7,000 a year. There are more veterans dying by their own hand than are being killed by the enemy now. Bottom line is the inability to establish a sense of purpose is a big part of it. Now there are other things like this new signature weapon, the IEDs that explode by roadside and battle your brain. It kind of destroy your brain over a long period of time, and that's another one of the things that's happening, contributing to suicide. And then the people who are mentally ill don't necessarily commit suicide, but the people who are mentally ill and are hopeless and helpless and don't have a sense of purpose are much more vulnerable to it.
You touched on the thank you for your service, which we all say. I come from a long line of military veterans, and I've done it myself because I feel compelled to say something. But you've divided what we can do into a couple of categories, and one of them is a category of comfort issues. Tell us a little bit about what we can do when we are engaged. We meet a veteran on the subway or at a grocery store. How is it that we can engage more effectively?
Most people say thank you for your service in part because we feel guilty that they're doing the work and we're not there, and the servicemen know that. So I think you got to make a commitment. Do you want to be sincere and kind to people? And if you do, then you look veterans in the eye, you shake their hands, you might even shake them with both your hands, and ask them about their service. I mean, ask them where they were, ask them where they were trained, ask them where they were deployed, find out what kind of job they had, find out if their training was appropriate to where they were, how many times were they deployed, what was the effect on their family. Have a regular conversation. I think you'll find it very inspirational. And in civilian life where you meet somebody who's handicapped or doesn't have arms or legs or something, you sort of don't know what to say. I found it's exactly the opposite in the service. I mean, if you talk to them about it, they will tell you.
Well, that's one of the things I was going to ask you. Is it appropriate to ask someone about their injury? I feel that's so personal, and yet you feel just the opposite.
When I was at Walter Reed, if you see in the cafeteria, you see service members without arms, without legs, negotiating the cafeteria with their girlfriends. I was standing in an elevator one time, and a quadriplegic with his stub, runs his wheelchair, and he comes up next to me, and the elevator door opens, and he says, "After you, sir." I mean, I didn't know what to say, but the appropriate thing would have been, obviously you were injured, tell me about it. And they'd be happy to describe it.
Certainly.
Because they're proud of what they've done. And I found it so inspirational. I mean,
it's incredible. One of the things you talked about, Dr. Beal, is engagement. And can you give us some examples of what exactly you mean when you talk about engaging with veterans? More effectively, I guess I should add.
Well, everybody has, been at McDonald's or been at a gas station and a service member's there. Go in and pay for their gasoline or buy them their lunch. When you contribute money to a college education fund, earmark your contribution for returning veterans. If you have a lot of frequent flyer miles, you could donate it to the Hero Fund. Because they'll give it to families that are flying in to be with their service members.
That's great.
You can visit veterans hospitals. You can visit nursing homes where older veterans are. If you have a particular skill, like you're an accountant or a lawyer or even an electrician or a plumber, donate some of your time to service members. One of the things I think everybody would find most inspiring is to go to a funeral. The funerals are just, the military does a good job with fighting, but they are really good with funerals.
Yes.
And even if you don't know the person, you'd find it. And you could go to any of the memorials that we have, or here in DC, you could go down. The World War II flights come in frequently, bringing people to see the World War II monuments.
Absolutely. Well, all wonderful suggestions, and War Stories from the Forgotten Soldiers really lifts the veil on what things we don't even know that are happening with our veterans who are returning. And so thank you for doing that. And I think that when people begin to read more of the stories and begin to understand more intimately what goes on in the mind of a returning veteran, we're going to understand, our communication will improve. Dr. Beal, thank you so much for joining us on Veterans in Transition.
That's all for this edition of Veterans in Transition. We ask that you like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Remember, everyone has a story to tell. Until next time.